And on one hand, like your rational self thinks that, yeah, I never gave, an SLA for my open source users.
Which is 100% true.
Which is 100% true. And then on the other hand, you go like, yeah, but that's not how I would like to be treated myself.
Yeah, exactly.
But it doesn't scale. You're only one person. And if I was to give the kind of like prompt, in-depth, thoughtful response for every communication that comes my way, on all of the projects that I'm involved with, like at the ideal level, maybe that would take like my entire weekend, or that wouldn't even be like enough hours in a day or something like that, right? If you're running like a one-man show project like that or something. Mm-hmm. So you have to weigh those things, right? So yeah, some things are just not scalable in that sense.
Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Welcome back, friends. This is the Changelog, a podcast featuring the hackers, the leaders, and the innovators in the world of software. I'm Adam Stacoviak, editor-in-chief here at Changelog. Today, we welcome Hisham Mohammed into our maintainer spotlight. This is a special flavor of the Changelog where we focus on maintainers and their journey. And Hisham is the creator of htop, a well-known cross-platform interactive process viewer. And today's conversation with Hisham covers the gamut of being an open source software maintainer. To set the stage, a new version of htop was announced, but not by Hisham. It was a kind takeover of his project, and needless to say, Hisham was surprised, but ultimately relieved. Why? Well, that's what this episode is all about. Special thanks to TileLift for partnering with us to co-produce this flavor of the Changelog. We call it Maintainer Spotlight. Check them out at TileLift.com. All right, let's do this.
So Hisham, first of all, thanks for coming on Maintainer Spotlight. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I guess I should start by saying thanks for htop. I've been using htop for years. And I even have a long-standing bash alias that says if htop is on this machine, alias top to htop, because it aims to be a better top, and it certainly is in my opinion. So I'll use it whenever possible.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's appreciated. Yeah, I have that alias as well.
I think a lot of us do. So we're here to talk about not just htop. You have lots of things going on. Gobo Linux. You have other projects that you're interested in, things still not announced quite yet, but coming soon. And htop just hit 3.0, and this was a big release, maybe not so much because of what was in the release, although there are features in there. There are a lot of updates, a lot of bug fixes in there, but really how 3.0 came together, because this was long time kind of unmaintained by you. Do you want to tell the story of your recent htop history and what happened?
Yeah, sure. I can go through that story. Well, htop 3.0, like after maintaining htop for over 15 years, htop 3.0 was a surprise to me. I literally woke up one Saturday morning and I had a Twitter notification that someone tagged me in a news post about the release of htop 3.0. And that, which said htop 3.0 released, the project has been taken over by a group of maintainers after prolonged inactivity from Hisham, from myself, right? So yeah, and well, I jumped out of the bed to check.
This was a pleasant surprise. This was not like, oh no, someone hacked my machine.
No, yeah. So yeah, I jumped out of bed and I need to and I just straight ran into to write a reply on GitHub, because there was an open GitHub issue that title, is this project still maintained? And I wrote a response there, and I started the response with, I don't have it open here to get it literally, but I pretty much started it with, first of all, I'm very happy to see this, because I'm sure that everyone who saw this news and who knew me as the maintainer would have questions like what happened. And so I ended up writing this long post on which I explained what went on. And so in that post, I say a lot of things. And one of them was that my first reaction when I saw that tweet was, to be honest, one of relief. And so essentially, like at this moment, I'm like retiring from htop maintainership. Mm-hmm. And well, I saw all of the whole thread that was going in that GitHub issue about asking if the project was maintained. People were going like, I wonder if he's okay. Like everything was like super respectful and friendly. And someone said, well, his GitHub activity continues to be green, like in the, the tiles with your early activity. And right. But I wasn't answering the emails and all of that. So what happened there was really that at one point, htop has a long history. And as time went on, the project really started as a way for me to in a typical free open source software, scratch your own itch, take something that you're annoyed by and try to fix it. So I started the project many years ago, and at one point I considered it pretty much done, for my own use, right? And then it was maintenance that went on, and I started to take longer and longer breaks from the project, right? And then sometimes it would take 6 months, and then I would look back at it, merge a couple of PRs, fix something here and there, and make another release. It was always for a long time, it was kind of a low-key maintenance thing, for years on, because if you have used htop for a long time, you've noticed it pretty much looked the same for a long time, and it has become this sort of reliable, dependable thing that's kind of there and works the way I want it to work. So at one point I started looking at CP, some other things, you don't expect the copy command to change a lot overnight or something like that. So so it felt pretty much done to me. And those breaks kept getting longer and longer. And eventually I at one point, I had an email filter that just sent everything that mentioned htop to an email folder, which I would occasionally, maybe twice a year, look at it and do batch maintenance. Mm. But as you said, I'm so involved in so many things, and I think we're going to touch on the point of burnout, more deeply later, because it's an interesting topic. But at one point, I realized that I hadn't looked at the project for a whole year, and I felt a sort of sigh of relief, oh, that was refreshing, right? I wrote it down there in that post mentioning this. So and then I realized I started actually thinking about handing over the project, but I've never done that before for an open source project. How do you to find someone to pass it on, and if you find it to be sort of a burden to you, do you want to instill that burden on others, and you feel that mixed feelings about your responsibility to the project, but then along that mix of emotions, months flew by again and I did nothing, right? And and when I realized, I guess it was a year and a half, and and then I'm just gonna fast forward to that day when the announcement came. So so basically I told this whole story there, and to show my side of what's going on, what was happening, and reaction has been overall positive from all sides, right? The new maintainers, I got in touch with them. And I apologized to them for having to have that one side decision of forking the project, which I understand is not the ideal way of doing things. And I said okay, all's well when it ends well. Yeah, and at the same time, I made myself available for any of the transition matters. My old website now redirects to the new one, which has a much cooler domain, by the way, htop.dev.
Cool domain.
Yeah, and that's what happened basically. Mm. And now I'm very happy that's it's an actual group of maintainers. It's a collective now. I think the project is in very good hands, and I'm very happy from how it turned out. To some people, it might have been my reaction might have been a surprise, but but I think, as I said, I think this is free open source software working as intended, and it has been overall positive from all sides.
Well, you got that email filter there that filters out htop. And coming back to it every once in a while is one thing, because you need those natural breaks. I mean, if you don't, I suppose, think something needs to be advanced, or in your expression of it, you mentioned how it was sort of done to you. But you mentioned there's a couple other people that try to reach out to you about changes to it, and maybe that's sort of the feedback loop being broken, so to speak, of a maintainer or creator of a project not really hearing the community. And that's kind of what happened, right? Was that you'd filter the emails and people were trying to reach out to you to sort of collaborate. I suppose in this new GitHub fashion, new GitHub meaning like the last 10 years of GitHub or more of how it's become more and more collaborative, but they tried to reach out and you just were in and out of the project as you saw fit, like, because that's just how it worked for you. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I see different projects in very different ways. Like for in open source, like everything always like falls under that same umbrella of, based on the licenses and all of that.
Yeah.
But the nature of projects is very different. Because for me, htop was always like this, kind of like one person hobby project. There was never a developer team and all or any of that. And I am part of other projects which are more collaborative, and you feel that sense of, responsibility and communicating and all of that. But for htop, like back from the start, that was like 2004. It was a very different world back then. Like you're talking about like GitHub in the last 10 years, but this was started back in the days of SourceForge.
Yeah.
Those of us who are old enough to remember, and the dynamics were very different, right? It would have like a mailing list or something like that, and. And many of the licenses in free software, they come with the whole thing, like this is offered as is with no warranty, in capital letters. And again, like sometimes projects have this like implied notion that, you're responsible to actually be available and, whenever someone reaches out to you or something like that. But in that sense, that no warranty comes with that as well, right? Sometimes people will just, here's something I did, here's the code. Well, if it's useful for you, right, feel free to use it. But, I'm not really on the hook for like, answering the emails like in a timely fashion or any of that. Of course, I try to be like, I like it when I reach out to other free software maintainers and, and they're responsive to me, right? And I like, as I said, like as at the same time, because like I have another project where I'm the maintainer of the Lua language package manager, Lua Rocks, and that has an ecosystem around it of, other developers who, develop Lua modules and put it on the repository, so that, that is a very much a live project that needs, that tending to, right, that housekeeping. Whereas htop was this kind of hobby weekend thing where, sometimes I will hack on it for a while and sometimes not. And I treated those very differently. And I guess at one point I started that, email filtering thing as sort of an organizing thing. Like, oh, I can't look into this right now, but I don't want it to slip away, in the inbox mess. I'm just set everything htop aside so that next time I look at htop, in my next round of, playing with the project, absolutely. I will get to this.
Right.
Well, it makes jumping back into things a little easier if you've got sort of a collective, but you don't want to be distracted because it doesn't require daily maintenance or even monthly maintenance. It's more like,
in the meantime,
when I want to look at it, this is where I go, and it's easy, so you will procrastinate less, and maybe, there's a lot of psychological things you could do to yourself to sort of be productive with what matters most today. This kind of reminds me, Jared, though, of something that Nadia said recently when we talked to her, which was like, not really a one-to-one, but more like, if it's public, it doesn't mean that it's participatory. And so not so much that htop wasn't open source and available for others to participate, but more like, as you had said, Hisham, is like, that it's more like it's a one-person project. It doesn't need a lot of people involved in it. It's not active like maybe Lua Rocks might be. So, you weren't really sort of paying attention to the fact that others might want to share their opinions and interact and progress the project as natural open source kind of is today. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and because in fact, there were many releases, like past releases of htop, which were mostly based on me merging community contributions. And, and then I figured that, okay, like I'm going to do a round of maintenance on this, in which I'm going to look at all of the PRs, which take time. Sometimes assessing the validity of a PR, like it actually takes longer than it takes to write it. Right, because you want to.
Right. Some
people would just like send you like a change. Well, okay, I tried something out, it kind of works for me, and then I had to look at it like, will it work for everybody, right? Or will this crash any other corner cases and things like that? Like, what about the systems that I can test myself? Like ever since htop became portable and wasn't a Linux only thing, right? Like that increased because. Someone might come out of the blue and send you like a huge patch with support for a new operating system, which, you have no way to test. This has happened. Like I've gotten like a huge patch which was like very intrusive with many like considerable changes for adding for IBM AIX support, right? Which like I don't even.
Did you merge that?
I don't even know what's the status of AIX is nowadays, right? It's kind of a legacy Unix by now, which like, and I looked at it like it was this huge patch. I said like I have no way to test it and probably no way to maintain it myself. Like, okay, like what if anything goes wrong and someone complains that something's not working, or if this breaks something else? So at that point, it's like for that one patch, I just let it slide and say like, okay, like if you folks like want to run it on AIX, like I guess you guys can maintain your own fork with it, and then essentially do the maintenance of that. Like for on the other hand, like the Solaris one, I did merge in, right? Because there's the whole open Solaris and like that's like Illumos and the subsequent systems that do follow on that tradition, and that I said, okay, that will have like a more of a living open source community around it, and I might be able to ping more people to help me out on that one. So yeah, so even that baseline maintenance work, that you do in batches, it's like sometimes it is significant, it can be significant, but yes, of course, there were lots of people who had reached out to me over time, and like it's amazing getting those patches. And at one point I joked around to say like, yeah, the software is writing itself, because like all I'm doing is clicking the merge button. Like there were htop releases, like even as far as like 10 years ago, which had like, not a lot of code from myself, right? Which I like lines of code which I've written myself. Like it was mostly merging patches. For stable projects, that sort of becomes the norm over time.
Mm-hmm. What I found interesting about this thread, it probably wasn't interesting to the people involved, might have been frustrating to them, but interesting to me was how they were kind of becoming, htop archaeologists, like what's going on with this project, because the initial is this maintained issue was open all the way back in March. Here we are in September. I think you replied a couple of weeks ago. So, the story began in March on this thread, ended at the end of August. And in the meantime, like you said, you were doing other work. You have your Lua Rocks, you have Gobo Linux, you have, I think some of your work is also open source or public on GitHub. So like you said, the GitHub contributions were happening. Maybe you're posting to your blog. I don't know if you were tweeting or whatever. In the meantime, because you had that email filter set up, like you weren't seeing any of this activity. And it's fun to read. They're like, well, it looks like the guy's alive and doing well. He's just not replying here. So, they're starting to figure out like, okay, what's going on here? And eventually people stepped up, which like you said, this seems like a very much an open source success story, because you've had this desire to hand it off over the years. It's kind of done to you. It does what you want it to do. Maintenance is a burden, but one that you're willing to, do every once in a while for a while. But if you could have had a reliable person or people, maybe 5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, whenever it was, you probably would have handed it off then. And by a matter of circumstance here, you just kind of ignored it, filtered it to a place you weren't looking, and people just popped up out of nowhere and said, hey, I can maintain this. And it's somewhat rare. It happens, but it doesn't happen all that often. And there were a lot of people who just stepped up and took over. Pretty cool.
It's funny to think about it, because yes, I was working on GitHub, I was tweeting, it was, just like life was going on as normal. Like as the way you described it, I was thinking in the back of my head, like it's so funny, like it's kind of an observation of the state of technology and the way we communicate nowadays and all of that. Because like if it wasn't the 90s, someone would have called me on the phone, I guess, right, about this, And I think what happened specifically in my case, like it also had a lot to do with the burnout angle of things, because one of the things that I mentioned in that message that I posted that Saturday morning was that at one point in time, I had a conversation where I was talking about burnout and open source maintenance, and in which I said, well, if a project is like unmaintained and like important enough, then it will be eventually forked, if people actually need. Like if there's a concrete need for the fixes to get in and for things to move on, they will. And I wrote that, and then I after writing that, after posting it, like I recalled what was the context in which I actually said that, and it was actually at one of the Google Summer of Code Mentor Summit sessions, for which like I have been like for a number of years a mentor at that event, like mentoring students on open source for the Lorax project. And we had that session where it was all like a room full of open source maintainers, and we were all talking about burnout, and people were talking about like, you know, that feeling of responsibility that they had for their projects, and how they felt that they could never take time off, and all of that, you know, and how pressured they felt about that, and how that was one of the things leading to burnout. And at that point, I mentioned, like, said, I'm here for Lorax, but I also maintain htop, and I kind of take regular breaks from that project, you know, and people like stared at me, you know, with, you know, wide eyes and go like, what? Like, you don't look at it like every single day, and like, you know, what if someone, you know, has something like, I go like, well, if something is critical, I'll probably get to know it like sooner or later, which did happen at one point. Like there was this crazy bug hitting Apple, like Mac systems, in which there was a kernel bug in Mac OS, which htop, by trying to read the state of threads, it was like consuming some resource from the kernel. And like it turns out that like opening htop managed to crash the Mac OS kernel.
Wow.
So like that was actually...
Congratulations.
Yeah, so like that
Quite a feat.
Yeah, like at first I looked at it and I was like, well, that's Apple's problem. They should fix their kernel, right?
Right.
But that was like the most commented thread on the history of the project, with like more than like, you know, I don't know, there were like 200 messages and something like that. And I was like, okay, I'm going to put a mitigation for this, you know, until like Apple, you know, gets its act together. And yeah, so I did that. Like, so I kept that in mind. I thought like, okay, if something gets critical to that point, I will know about it, like even between my breaks. And I guess this htop 3.0 was kind of a similar event, but otherwise I said like, you know, like we can't let ourselves, like, it can get super overwhelming, you know, and I understand that like as htop is important for me and for like lots of people, and as I said, like the fact that it was forked meant that it was really like important for someone, like important enough for people to put in that effort, and I feel super flattered, you know, and I feel like it's one of like, you know, probably like one of the things like in my professional career, like as a software developer, that I'm like most proud of, like having you know, written this project and having see it become like an open source success in that sense. Like as important that software is, you know, like people's like mental health and all of that, you know, it's more important than that, right? So like
totally.
when I was in that session and I was talking to other open source developers, which, you know, they felt like super pressured, you know, and super unhappy with that situation and not knowing what to do. Like I told them, you know, what I told them that day was like, hey, take breaks, and, you know, if you need, and, you know, and if something happens, like things will, you know, eventually sort out by themselves, because, you know, the software, it's out there, it's in the open, you know, it's kind of like, that's something that we can do, you know, in open source. You know, if the project was, you know, proprietary, even if it had like a huge user base community, that would like, and I decided to disappear, there would be nothing that could be done. Mm-hmm. Right? People would have to, I don't know, like try to write it again from scratch or something like that. Right? But then it would not have been an option. You know, open source does give you that option. So maintainers, you know, should keep that in mind. Like that, you know, that they should take breaks if they need.
Right. It might also be in a sweet spot in scope. I didn't look at the lines of code and all that, and how complex of a project htop is. Conceptually, at least, it seems like the kind of thing where if you're going to hop in and maintain, right, if you have pull requests, you have bug fixes, you have like minor things, is it the kind of project where you could grok it after a little while and kind of start to dink around, or is it massively complex? Because sometimes a piece of software has the value, like you said, if it's valuable, somebody will fork it, somebody will maintain it. Sometimes the people that are relying on it don't have the skills, and they're not going to have the time or the money to acquire the skills. They would love to maintain it if they could, but they can't. In this case, it seems like there's some people who are willing to and able to maintain htop.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, that does factor in. And yeah, I think like for htop's case, well, everyone likes to believe that they write clean code, right? And I always felt that the code base was approachable, given that, the number of PRs I got over the years and that, that people would add features and send in stuff, right? So I was never like too worried on that regard. Like I have seen projects that went and maintained, which ended up in this situation that you described, in which people say like, oh my God, like this is super important, but the code base is like inexecutable, because it's
right.
not because it's badly written, but because it's like ultra complex and things like that. In the case of htop, I don't think it to be like super complicated. And I actually I was complimented by the new maintainers. They say like, okay, thanks for maintaining. Like in one of our like out of band like emails after the 3.0 release, they say like, okay, oh, thanks for having like it's been like fun to work on the code base. I was like, okay, glad you like it and enjoy it.
It's always nice.
As I said, like it's a matter of like how needed the maintenance is to people and what are the stakes, right? Because at the same time, when I look at the new maintainers, like some of their emails were like at redhat.com, at debian.org, they were coming from like established organizations, like established names in the open source world, that feels reassuring, and it feels like, okay, like these folks will have like, we'll have the time to and the resources to keep maintaining it, so that feels good. Like that, as I said, like as you said, like even for complex projects, that reminded me of the OpenSSL situation after Heartbleed, and people were like, okay, everyone's using this, and large companies, at one point, like they stepped
up.
Yeah. So I guess it's a matter of that, right? So.
Well, I guess a shout out is due to a few folks. Nathan Scott is one of the people who stepped up and kickstarted the fork. There's an account called Faster IT out of Germany, another GitHub account who seems like they were involved in the takeover. Anybody else? The cool thing is, because htop is so prevalent and been around for so long, is that it's in all the repos, right? Like you can apt-get it, you can yum install it. And I did see people from Debian hopping into that thread saying, yeah, if you guys want to maintain this, because one of the problems is if you hadn't showed up, like taking over maintenance would have been much more difficult, I imagine, because it's not just the source code, it's the distribution. And I'm sure that you have some sort of interaction with the distributors. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And let's give a shout out to Nathan Scott and also to Graham Ings and Daniel Lange. I don't know where in the world he's from. So whether I should like pronounce that in a English or German way. And yes, I did. I got in touch with maintainers of a few distros to confirm, yes, like moving on for the next releases, get the upstream from here, like htop.dev is the new upstream. This is, and I made the point like that very morning, I made a point of redirecting the website to the new one so that the URL pointed to, so that would be like a clear indication that, and also now under my personal GitHub account, the repo is now archived. And the README points to the new one because that how like we didn't transfer over the repo because the new one had already been kickstarted and already had like new issues, new PRs, and we didn't want to overwrite any of the new activity. And at the same time, I think it's good to like give the new maintainers like a clean slate where they can like so. And as I said, like same again to say, oh, if any of the old PRs is like super important, they will be ported over. So like they got in touch and and to like left comments in the old PRs and telling people to like, hey, like consider reopening there in the new repo if you still want this merged and all of that. I understand that it's important that I got involved, and I think it does help a lot. And as I said, like if something like this happened, and which I never actually foreseen this to happen, but if something of this kind would have happened, like eventually I would expect to get involved and yeah.
What up, friends? I want to share with you a few details about the TileLift subscription. It is a managed open source subscription backed by project maintainers. And as you may know, this series, Maintainer Spotlight, is produced in partnership with TileLift because we love what they're doing and we believe in them. So if you're building applications with open source, TileLift helps you to ensure that you have components that just work, including comprehensive security updates, active maintenance, and accurate licensing, which is so helpful. TileLift helps you to speed up application development, save money, and reduce risk when building apps using open source. And best of all, with the TileLift subscription, you help open source maintainers like we feature on this show to get paid for their work. Learn more and get a demo at tilelift.com. Again, tilelift.com.
So you seem to have a pretty healthy relationship with your open source projects. The ability to step away, I think, is a skill or maybe a personality trait which you have. I'm curious on the other end, when you hand off something which you've maintained for very long, which you created, right? Like this was your brainchild, this was your baby for all these years, and you've given it to a bunch of strangers. Does that concern you? Like, what if they destroy htop and it sucks after this? Or like, is there any sort of those feelings of like, maybe it's going to not be maintained the way that I would want to, or as well as I would do it? Any of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and probably something that, a long time ago, like a younger version of me might have worried about, right? But I think over time, you rethink things. Well, the older versions, like, they will always be there, right? If that's
Right.
my open source legacy, and people want
Your name on the commit messages.
yeah, if
right?
people want to check out, what was it like when I was involved, it will always be there.
Right, true.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, I'm happier to see it live on, right? In that sense, right? Because
Yeah.
I think that's the ultimate success of an open source project. Outlives its original maintainers, and and carries on. So in that sense, I think, like, the way I look at it nowadays, like, I think that's like the ultimate success, right? To be able to reach that point. And like, I have other projects which I would love to retire from, but which I don't know if there would be new maintainers. Actually, I'm actively thinking about this now. Like, should I, now that I've seen this happen once, should I be proactive on this?
It can happen.
Right?
Yeah.
It can happen. Should I be proactive and say, like, okay, we're looking for new maintainers, and as I said,
So what do you got? What projects are you looking for new maintainers? We happen to have a podcast with software developers who listen to it. So are you looking for maintainers? I mean, put up a sign.
Yeah, like, as of now, like, LoRox itself, like, it's a project that I'm sort of overwhelmed by nowadays, because I've been, like, lead maintaining it for a long time. That project started in 2006, I guess.
It's a long time.
Is there a team around you for that one?
Yeah, so around LoRox, there are other maintainers, but it's very much on like whenever I'm available basis as well. They're not like regular maintainers. And I keep LoRox going as part of my work as well. So this is something that I am involved with because we use it at work. But I would love to see someone step up and take the lead in the project, so I could still be involved, but not in a leading position. And I'm trying to figure out how to do it, because sometimes, like, in projects, inertia is very strong. Like, people will not, people will not say, like, hey, I would like to lead, if there is someone else leading, and all those kinds of things. And regarding my personal relationship with my projects, like, I've realized that, well, Gobo Linux, which is this super experimental alternative Linux distro that I started back in college, with my college friends, and which I use it to this day. My system, like, if you look at my laptop, it's this like super hacky, running like all sorts of experimental stuff, like including like the distro, like this. It's super hacky, including this distro that we maintain on like with a very small group of people. And that kind of project is one that we also maintain, like, in this, like, every couple of years, we get together and we cook up a new version. Like, it's not for general use, like, at all. When we look at it, like, I had this bunch of projects which I started, like, in the early 2000s, and which I have been maintaining for a long time. And at one point in time, I was like, yeah, now, mostly of what I do now is maintenance, and I haven't started a new project in a long time. Right, and I started to feel this itch of, like, starting new projects and, like, having more freedom to be creative again, right? Like, because and as life goes by, there's work and there's like you have a lot less time to do that. And like the few time that I had for open source projects, I wanted to spend in more creative ways. So that had to do with me like stepping away from htop for so long, because that's the time that I had to try new things and all of that.
Well, if you want to find a new maintainer for Lua Rocks, what you do is you create a folder in your email and you send all your Lua Rocks stuff to that. Then you ignore it for 6 months, and then boom, someone's going to pop up.
There you go.
Yeah, so
there it is.
Yeah, that's
that's the formula. We found it.
Yeah, as funny as that sounds, that comes to what I was saying earlier about the different nature of open source projects, right? Because Lua Rocks has this like live server, luarocks.org, with people like, uploading things, downloading things.
Just like, different beast.
Exactly, like the server. Like I maintain the CLI tool. The server component has a different maintainer. Shout out to Leaf, who maintains the luarocks.org server. So that project has a community around it, and it has that different, maintenance style as a necessity, right? So for that one, I could never do that, and nothing of that sort ever happened with luarocks, because things go into my inbox and I do check it out and have a different maintenance style for that project. Depending on the nature of what you do, like some different maintenance styles come with it, right? So for luarocks, it was kind of different, and assume it will be somewhat more difficult. But then again, there's like bus factor and all of that, right? If I disappeared for real tomorrow, right? I'm sure eventually things would be like sorted out, because luarocks is used quite a lot by the Lua community, right? So now I think now seeing what happened with htop, I think like, okay, it's possible to do this. I just have to now figure out the way to adapt to a new role.
Yeah. You mentioned relief in particular, though, right? In your response, and even at the start of the show, you mentioned that your response, while you got this notification of 3.0 for htop, via Twitter, so this not normal way to be told about changes to your project, you weren't pissed off. You weren't upset. You were relieved.
Happy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, maybe juxtaposition those, like with Lua Rocks, if you got a Twitter notification tomorrow that there was a new lead maintainer of the CLI tool for Lua Rocks, would you be relieved or would you be upset?
No, I would be happy for that. As I said, like I would consider that to be a mark of success for the project. Yeah. And and in the end, we have to keep in mind like there's in open source, there's people throw around that word community a lot as this kind of like random concept, but in the end it's really people. It's really about people. And recently in the Lua community, like I had someone who I consider a friend, even though I never met him personally, who passed away like suddenly, and and we had to, some of my projects I had handed over to him like in the past. So like I had made like the coverage analysis tool for Lua, like LuaCov, like and he had been maintaining it for a few years after I had started the project and maintained it myself for a few years. And so there was this whole commotion in the community, like with his passing, and we had to scramble. Okay, what happens with his projects now? Like I sort of like inherited back, the ones that I had passed to him, and like took it on myself, like as a personal matter, to figure out what to do with those projects moving on. And then some of the other projects, the community got together, to get necessary patches merged and new releases out and all of that, right? And it's a pretty strong wake-up call, like that's like to you about like, like what does really matter here, right? It's really a community of people, right, who care about each other and who care about like, who got to know each other through the work that they do, right? But in the end, right, when you build a community of people, right, you have to keep that in mind, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So to me, like whenever like, because of the pandemic, Lua Workshop was supposed to be held in Germany this year. It was canceled. And I remember a couple of years ago, Lua Workshop was in Lithuania, and like a bunch of us flew over to Lithuania, like from Brazil, from France, from the US, from the Netherlands, from all over. And like at one point I said like, yeah, like I come to this workshop, because of you folks, like to meet the people who have become my friends over the years, like not so much about like Lua itself or, the talks, or like we go there and we give talks to each other, to our, we present the talks, and it's like there's always new people, right? Who are, getting into the community and getting to like know folks. And so, yeah, like this is super important. And in the end, like it's a huge part of, why I do open source nowadays, why I keep doing it.
You seem to have a deep connection to other people. And going back to the relief, the relief was from what though?
Yeah, because you kind of have that sense of lingering guilt when you're not responsive, right?
Right.
If you take the time to like, it's so you would have to balance. Okay, now I'm taking this break for myself, but what if I was on the other side and I had this, this bug that was hitting me every day. At one point I get so, annoyed that I decide to hack on it and, fix it. Then I fix it, then I open a PR and I send it over and say like, okay, please get into the next version, right? And I go months without an answer, right? Like,
yeah. I've been on that side of a relationship before with a project a couple of times.
Yeah.
Not where it's so like I can live off of my own fork, or I can just, depend on that and I'm okay. Like it's not like a huge, my life is ruined or my business is ruined scenario. But like you said, you take the time, you're usually somewhat angry because it's not working the way you need it to. And there's ramp up time, right? Like figure out, how do I contribute to this thing? Where do I even put this in? Am I going to break it? There's all the questions like, how do I talk nicely? And you do all the work. And it can take hours and submit a patch. And then it just never goes anywhere. I've been on that side, and maybe you have as well. As a member of the open source world, you kind of go on both sides. Sometimes you're the maintainer, sometimes you're the submitter. And I wouldn't say it like hurts, but it definitely weighs, it sucks when that happens. And so I could see from your perspective, the guilt of saying like, knowing like, well, I got all these PRs out there, I got these open issues, and I can't look at them because I'm living my life and all the reasons that we've stated, but they're still there. And those are real people on the other end of those PRs.
Yeah, it comes from acknowledging that it's real people, like as you said, like on both sides, and on one hand, like your rational self thinks that I've never gave an SLA for my open source users,
which is 100% true.
Which is 100% true, and then on the other hand, you go like, but that's not how I would like to be treated myself.
Yeah, exactly.
But it doesn't scale. You're only one person, and if I was to give the kind of like prompt, in-depth, thoughtful response for every communication that comes my way, on all of the projects that I'm involved with, like at the ideal level, maybe that would take like my entire weekend, or that wouldn't even be like enough hours in a day or something like that, right? If you're running like a one-man show project like that or something. Mm-hmm. So you have to weigh those things, right? So some things are just not scalable in that sense.
Well, you feel guilty, right, for not responding or not showing up, but then you're sort of trapped, so to speak, because there is no playbook that I'm aware of, at least. And if there is one, let's put it in the show notes or highlight it more, of how to be a one-person-ish maintainer. Maybe take contributions, as you mentioned, have you been doing before, like the code writing itself, so to speak, as you'd mentioned. But how do you care about something like this, be the creator and maintainer of it for so long, but then be able to hand it off in a way that lets it have life, doesn't ruin it, as Jared mentioned before? And there's just it's kind of icky, right? Like there is no easy button for it, so you just never do it, right? You just sort of procrastinate. You kick the can down the road a little bit further because there's no...
Yeah, because you don't know how.
Yeah, it's not easy to do. There's no right or wrong way, there's no playbook for saying, hey,
obviously, right way.
This is how you begin to hand off a project.
No, 100% agree. And even if you're not wanting to hand it off and you just wanted to keep going, but in a maintenance style, that makes it sustainable. And one thing to keep in mind is that like there are a lot more open source projects which are like one person shows like this and mm-hmm. like then Because when we think of open source, you can think of like the huge projects, I don't know, like GCC, the Linux kernel and all of that. And when people go like, how do I contribute to open source? Yeah, you start, with a tiny patch to, to some project, and people usually point folks to like huge projects and all that. But, if you look at, like, I don't know, like the GitHub archive, and things like that, like there are so many projects, which are, most of the repos are like one person only, and even some of many of the ones that are used a lot, like I see a lot of that in the Lua community because of the LuaRox repo, right? It's a lot of modules, right. Or if you look at like something like, many times bigger, like NPM, like how many of those packages are maintained by a single person, and there is no playbook on how to deal with that, and I think what we're doing here in this, in this conversation helps, right? Because I think one part of it is for people on both sides of the table to understand like the social contract, that's established between, maintainers and users. And especially for things like developer tools and things like that, we have this additional angle in which, often the user of, is also a maintainer of something else, but in many cases, for many types of software, that's not the case. And I think like step one is like an understanding of what goes on both sides, and sharing experiences. Okay, this is what happened for this project. These were the circumstances. These are the things that went well. These were the things that went not so well. Right? I do not consider like this to be like a like a fully like smooth transition. Right? As you said, like there was this whole like thread that went on from March until now. Right, mm-hmm. Which that could have been like easily avoided, and I totally take the responsibility for that. We're happy that the outcome was positive, right? But yeah, like it's important to share those experiences, like within the open source community at large. That's why I'm happy to be here. Talking to you guys about this, because we need to learn how things happen and like slowly try to improve them. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's the reason for this series, this Maintainer Spotlight series, is that we can share the stories of maintainers, right? The wins, the losses, the accidental successes, and all the things, because there's so much that goes into it. And because open source is such a broad thing, we're starting to have some formalization via Nadia Ekbald's work with Working in Public about how to like even talk about the different types of projects, right? Because it's so diverse that you can't just say, well, this is how you hand off a project, because there is no, this is how you hand off a project, right?
Yeah.
It's different every time.
Yeah.
And sometimes it goes great and sometimes it goes terrible, So yeah, I think sharing, creating community around maintainers, providing more conversations that say, oh, I listened to that, what Hisham did, that actually helped me out in my project because X, Y, or Z. So hopefully we have some of that effect, but you'd think over time we could maybe aggregate some sort of a knowledge base, or like a starting point, like, hey, I'm burnt out. I need to hand this off. Where do I start? Maybe we can start to create those kind of resources, but it's difficult and lacking at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fully agree. And it sounds like a great idea. Like, I think one good first step is recognizing like the different types of projects, the different types of communities, different types of, maintenance styles. Like, as I said, I've been like engaging in like multiple different maintenance styles at the same time, right? Like for htop, I was taking this hobbyist, like once in a while approach. For LuaRox, LuaRox is this kind of like old project, which is also kind of in maintenance mode. We're not making any earth-shattering changes on it at this time, but it's important enough for a community that we want to keep it working. And if anything breaks, it gets like immediately noticed, and it has this like the whole server side aspect has this, very much like online, effect. Like it has to be up, right? So that requires a different maintenance style. Like at the same time, I do open source at work. So when you have like an open source project that's backed by a company, that has a completely different maintenance style, right? So, and sometimes you have projects that it's like, you do it once and, and throw it away and then say like, okay, like, I don't expect to give like any kind of maintenance to it, but I'm going to just put it out there, like in case it's useful for someone, right? And in which cases you might even mark it on the README, right? Say like, yeah, it's just here, but it's like, don't use it in production or whatever. Like you see lots of projects like that, right? And so yeah, like all of these types exist. Like maybe we should start, like talking more about this, like giving those styles, I don't know, names, so that, this is a project of type X, this is a project of type Y, and then people would immediately understand and not have a stigma of the kind of interactions that they will or will not get from it, and things like that. So yeah, I'm all for having those type of conversations and having.
Yeah. So Nadia Ekbal has come up with a taxonomy that has 4 types of projects. And it's based on the relationship with user growth to contributor growth. And so your project, htop, would be what she calls a stadium, because you have one or very few maintainers, and the user growth grows dramatically, but the contributor growth stays relatively small. Then there's a project like Lua Rocks, which I'm not sure if that would be a club, or what was the other 2 types? I don't know. I'm going right off the top of my head.
Yeah.
There's clubs, there's stadiums, foundations play into it. What's that one called? Anyways, I need to go read the book again. I need to do my studying, but that particular taxonomy, I'm sure our listeners are yelling into their AirPods, like, oh, get it right, it's derivative, right? It's based on observing a project and saying, based on the project's relationship with its users and its contributors, it's X, Y, or Z. But what I think would be also useful, and I mentioned this to her, and she seemed to have some excitement around it, is what if you could explicitly state what you want your project to be? Like, not this is what it is because this is how it worked out, but like give this project a name. This is a tool for me, or this is a club. Like, come join my club, or this is we have to come up with the names. But you could actually, like, people are using their READMEs to set some expectations, right? Like, pull request welcome, or hey, you can look at my code, but it's not really participatory. Like, people say those kind of things. But I agree with you that if we started giving names to these styles of projects, not what they end up being, but what they want to be up front, that could be like your step, add that to the list of things I do when I open source something. Yeah. Is I give it a name of what style it is, because then you come to their source code and you know immediately what to expect from that particular project.
Let me close the loop here because I happen to have a PDF of her book right here. So I just went ahead and searched it. So to quote the book, it says, focusing on the relationship between contributors and users, we can think of projects in terms of their contributor growth and user growth. And this gives us 4 production models: federations, clubs, toys, and stadiums.
Toys.
Yeah.
The one I couldn't remember. So the federation is, it's pretty close.
Yeah, you're pretty close.
So it's a start.
Yeah. I think it's important too, because naming things, something we say on brain science, and a lot of this is why I find this interesting, is there are a lot of psychological tie-overs to what we talk about on brain science, where we really focus on like what we know about the brain to kind of transform our lives, whether it's habits or working in teams or dealing with burnout or stepping away to get unstuck, all these fun things, or the power of our choices in our lives. We got to think about naming things to tame things. And that's what happens here. Like, because Nadia's able to give a taxonomy and an example, naming them helps us all as a collection, a community, to tame the idea of what does it mean to be a federation or a club or a toy or a stadium as an example of open source. And so names really give us all something to anchor to. And that's kind of, a great thing. So but it takes somebody to take that first step. And in this case, it was Nadia to give us those models and those names to anchor to.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Usually what happens is that people realize after the fact, what the project end up turning into, right?
Right.
And because often when you start, whenever they always start, they're always a one-person show anyway, right? And sometimes going like, okay, I'm starting this and I want this to be a federation can sound like this, like a super lofty goal, and like you don't know if anyone's gonna, pay attention to a project or care about it, or if you're going to be able to build a community. So people might be reluctant on that.
There are times like when Kubernetes came out of Google, for example, when the Kubernetes thing.
Yeah, but then it's coming from Google. Yeah,
I know, but again, that would be an opportunity for them to state what this project is, right?
Yeah, like current status essentially. Like, we aspire to be a stadium, or we aspire to be a federation, but right now we're a toy.
currently a toy, but it might become a
Yeah, you make a good point. Not all projects start from a single from a single person. Like they might start from a company and they might have they might start with a huge backing from day one, right? So it's part of that, right? It ties into not only on the relationship between users and maintainers, but also like funding, things like that. Like Lorax has like this varied history over time. Like the project was actually started back when I was doing my master's. And we had this, industry academy like joint research project for the development of Lua, because I was doing my master's over at the University PUC in Rio, which was where the Lua language was created. And so for that, I had funding to kickstart the project, right? So I was not doing it as a hobby, as a part-time thing. So that was my day job for 2 years as I was doing that. After the research project was gone, there was no more funding. For a few years, I kept maintaining it like on a volunteer kind of like hobbyist basis, right? But just because of my attachment to the project and all that, and we were talking about that sense of responsibility, like, okay, now this is out in the open, people are relying on it, and every now and then I would actually do a consulting gig that was like coming from like corporate users of it. And now I'm working at a company which uses it, so I'm again like effectively being paid to maintain it, right? Mm-hmm. And so my relationship, like the funding story for it has changed over time. My relationship with the project has changed over time. Like these things are very dynamic, and so which can be a complicating factor. But yes, like having names for things. Like I remember like. In the like early days of open source, when people were talking about like the cathedral and the bazaar, to compare different development styles, and they would call it, like, oh, open source is like this, and proprietary software is like this, like the cathedral, right. And even that is not precise, because, for example, the Lua language itself, my advisor, who was like my master's and PhD advisor, who was the creator of the language, Roberto Jeruzalimski, they have at PUC Rio a team of like 3 professors who single-handedly, develop and maintain the Lua language, like the reference implementation of it, like the language and its implementation. And it's open source, it's MIT licensed, and they've been doing this since the mid-90s. They do it to this day. They take no contributions or patches. Like all of the code is written by those 3 people. They have a mailing list. They take like feedback. They help run the Lua workshops. They're super friendly to the community and all of that. But they say like, no thanks. Because we're academics. We're like the result of our work goes in papers, and they're subject to that whole I don't know, like academic lifestyle, which is like very different from open source community. But then they go like, okay, like, I don't know if it's because, they want to, state in the papers that like this is our original work, because of like academic restrictions or whatnot, or if it's just the style that they personally prefer, right? Because they time and again, they say like, we'll take ideas, like suggestions, and then we'll implement it ourselves. But thanks, we don't want any contributions, right? So that's like, it's 100% a cathedral, but it has been open source like from day one. So it's whatever works for the maintainers.
What that makes me think of though is just clear communication and the need for a good feedback loop, right? So as a maintainer, as a contributor, as a user, that feedback loop and the clarity required. So those 3, this example you give for as an example, their community is probably more cool with, hey, they don't take contributions because they've been pretty clear with the expectation as a user or as a would-be or a desire to be a contributor. So not so much to call you out, but more like if that feedback loop was there for your users to say, hey, I take frequent sabbaticals, don't be offended. The SLA wasn't there, of course, but more so, less of pointing that out, but more so to say like, my takeaway is a couple things, is clear communication and that feedback loop that we all desire, because it helps us, I guess, to reduce our anxiety or our concerns or whatever. And then the other side is like the kindness that's required, because as you'd mentioned, it's software, sure, but it's really a community of people. And what I see that played out with this, this htop 3.0 and all that played out was those folks were very kind to you. They didn't think that, Hisham was ignoring them and he's a bad person. And in many ways, they were regarded and concerned to like, I hope it seems like he's okay because of these reasons, as Jared had said earlier. And I think that's what we all need to lead with, is this nature of kindness, rather than like what could have played out, which is this person's terrible because they just like had this repo or this project that's very useful. They're not responsive, and they could have like said a bunch of nasty things about you, but they led with kindness. And that's my takeaway is the need for clear communication and lead with kindness.
Yeah, for sure. Like that's like, this was like a super positive experience in which like I feel like I've come out a better person out of it, like from what I've learned, like as you said, like in terms of communication and all of that.
Yeah.
And also to participate in this episode in which like the kindness really went both ways, in the sense, as you said, like, they didn't think I was a terrible person. And at the same time, I didn't think they like, oh my God, they stole my project or anything like that.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So in that sense, the kindness really went both ways, and I think it becomes a multiplier. Like, I've never had so many like heart emojis in a GitHub comment on my life, and I probably don't expect to have it again. Right? That was like.
Well, on that front, let's give a shout out to A. Fontanet, the person who opened this particular issue back in March. Is this project maintained? Because a lot of times that very first nudge, that first comment, that first issue sets a tone, right? And they start off by saying, I want to emphasize right at the outset that I don't believe project maintainers have any kind of obligation to the community to continue working on a project. I'm very grateful for htop and all the work that has been put into this thus far. And then they go on to say, is this project maintained? But like, that's a great way to set a precedent of kindness and respect and empathy before you go ahead and say, is anybody maintaining this? Instead of just saying like, WTF, why aren't you maintaining this? Yeah. They really did set a tone, and that tone remained the entire, I read most of the thread. Almost everybody was positive, and they were adding to the conversation. Like I said, it became this archaeology. Where's Hisham? And then once you hopped in, it was kind of a love fest. So really, we see a lot of drama in GitHub issues. This is like the opposite case. This was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like it, and yeah, it's a great point that you made, like how it like setting the tone was something that kind of like guided the conversation, and also like that, and that first person said that, like, oh, I don't recall the exact words, I don't have it open like in front of me, but it says like, I'm not volunteering to become the maintainer or something like that, right? Because it's something you mentioned earlier, right? That not everybody has the like skills, time, inclination, whatever.
Totally.
Right, but that was a huge contribution to the project. That one message, right?
Right.
Sometimes that's all you need to do. And this is what I see a lot. Like, as I said, like sometimes there's a lot of drama in GitHub or like on the internet at large. But generally, like my relationship with open source, like with like, free software, those communities, like has been positive in that sense. I feel this thread is actually representative of my life with free and open source software. Really, if I fly out for a conference, I don't know, like whether it was like Fizzle International Free Software Forum that happened like, here in my neighborhood, like in Porto Alegre, southern Brazil, every year, where people from all over Latin America would fly here, or in Brussels at FOSDEM, where like the European free software folks get together, like it's always generally positive like that, right? Like we see a lot of like sometimes the drama and gets like over amplified on the internet, but when it comes to people meeting face to face, and I know that meeting face to face is not something available to everybody, right? So we have to be mindful of that. We have to, whenever we get the chance to meet people face to face, or even like over, a video call as I'm talking to you folks. So that's like a way of having a more personal connection. We have to carry that, to our like online, like written communications and interactions. Like I feel that like I kind of have sort of a pet peeve with the whole code review culture and what it is, because like I noticed like even the style of writing that people use when they're like doing code reviews is kind of different when they're like, sending a message on Slack or something. And when I noticed that, I decided to become like more like consciously informal, and go like, hey, looks like something like this is missing, blah, 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 emoji, whatever. Like, but not in a forced way, but like, okay, I'm gonna talk to this person the way I would talk to them in person, rather than, this seems inappropriate, at line 375.
Right.
Like, as if you're like the schoolmaster, grading someone's PR, like, this is acceptable. No, this is unacceptable, right? So it's kind of like, I think it boils down to this as well, how we communicate, how we interact with people. It makes a difference. right? So as you said, like the way the conversation starts is the way the conversation flows, right? And to that, yeah, for sure, that was super important.
And I'm so grateful that that's the case here. I think I mentioned it before. My takeaway is like, lead with kindness in these scenarios. And because of that, we can point back to this, not as a hostile takeover, but as a kind takeover, of this project. And we can all look back at this as an open source community and say, this was an example of things working out well and people being treated with respect and with empathy and having compassion. And rather than the drama that can sometimes ensue, because I think we forget that we are literally talking to other humans. It seems so logical, I suppose illogical potentially to think like that, but other humans, be authentic, talk to people with kindness and act as if they're there on the other line reading your words rather than just simply, I don't know, like a machine. I don't know. It's easier said than done sometimes, but that's my hope. This conversation and this example gives me hope that we have this opportunity in open source. But Sean, thanks so much for coming on the show and being open and honest and sharing your side of the story and all that it is. And even what this project meant to you, Little Rocks as well, and your contribution to open source and being a person that can, point back to doing things in a kind way and caring about actual people and showing up and whatnot. But thank you so much, Sean, for this time you've shared with us. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, folks, for for this space where we can talk about this. I know this has like a huge audience, and I hope this conversation becomes like useful for more people who are like perhaps in similar situations, or really that we can spread this kindness, I guess, like and make sure that this is the norm, in free and open source software and software in general, life in general. Like it goes beyond software, right?
Yep,
that's right.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic work hanging in for the whole show. That means you are a super fan. That means you're a prime candidate for being a Changelog Plus member. And if you haven't heard about this yet, this is the membership we launched so that our awesome audience can directly support us, get closer to the metal, and make the assets appear on our podcasts. Check it out at changelog.com/plus+. And if that isn't cool enough, the irony of this episode being 413 and the error code 413 standing for Payload Too Large, I don't know. That's super cool. Once again, huge thanks to Tyler for being an awesome partner in this podcast series. Also, huge thanks to Fastly, Linode, and Rollbar for having our back. And of course, Breakmaster Cylinder 2 for making all those awesome beats for us. That's it for this week. We'll see you next week.